Welcome back, bullies. Please like, share, and subscribe. Okay, let's solve some crime. Today, we're diving deep into the chilling story of Samuel Little,
Mm.
a name now pretty much synonymous with one of the most staggering numbers of confessed murders in American history.
That's right. I mean, the sources we look at, they detail his admission to an almost unbelievable number, 93 murders.
93. Just wow.
Yeah, between 1970 and 2005, and spread across 19 different states.
Yeah.
It really forces you to confront some uncomfortable truths, about how something like that could even happen.
Absolutely. And beyond just the sheer scale, what's so disturbing, I think, is the profile of his victims.
Right.
Primarily vulnerable women living right on the fringes of society, and the fact that his crimes went unnoticed for decades.
For decades.
So our aim in this deep dive is to really try and unpack how this could have possibly continued for so long and, what the details that eventually emerged reveal about the case, maybe even about wider issues.
Okay, so let's maybe start at the beginning. His early life. Our sources indicate he was born June 7th, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia.
And it sounds like his beginnings were, well, far from stable.
Yeah, it's putting it mildly.
Okay.
His mother is described as a teenage prostitute who reportedly abandoned him pretty early on.
Mm.
And he ended up being raised by his grandmother over in Lorain, Ohio.
You do have to wonder how that kind of early instability might shape a life. Though, as our sources caution, we can't just draw a straight line from that to the horrific acts he committed later.
No, that's a really crucial point. A difficult childhood, sure, it can be a contributing factor, but it's absolutely not a predictor of this kind of extreme violence.
Right.
We do see, though, a sort of continuation of instability into his adolescence. There are reports of behavioral problems, struggles in school. He eventually dropped out as a teenager.
And that period was followed by a pattern, wasn't it? Petty crimes, arrests, jail time for things like theft, assault, fraud.
Yep. So even pretty early on, there were these signs of trouble with the law.
Was there anything in those early offenses, though, that might have hinted at the scale of violence that was to come?
Not necessarily the scale, maybe, but the repeated instances of assault do suggest a propensity for violence, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I suppose so.
And then, following his teenage years, he adopted this really transient lifestyle, living out of his car, moving constantly between states.
That nomadic existence. The sources point out that became a huge problem for law enforcement trying to track him later, didn't it?
A massive obstacle. And this sort of drifting coincided with a continued pattern of crime. More arrests across multiple states, theft, assault, DUI.
It almost feels like a series of red flags that just weren't being connected. Why do you think his violent side seemed to kind of fly under the radar for so long?
Well, probably several factors. Operating across state lines, that definitely made it hard for any one jurisdiction to see the bigger picture.
Okay.
And he also reportedly targeted women in smaller towns, individuals he likely believed wouldn't get much attention if they just disappeared.
That's a calculation, isn't it? A deeply disturbing strategy based on exploiting vulnerability.
Absolutely. And then there's that significant moment in 1982 down in Florida, the murder of Patricia Mount.
Right. He was actually arrested for that one, went to trial.
He did. This seems like it should have been a pivotal point, a real chance to stop him much, much earlier.
So what went wrong there?
Well, according to the sources, Patricia Mount, she was 26, found strangled. Little was definitely linked to the crime, but the prosecution just didn't have what was considered conclusive evidence back then.
So he was acquitted.
He was acquitted. And it's just a stark example of how the legal system, even with the best intentions, can sometimes fail, with just devastating consequences.
Yeah. That acquittal basically allowed him to continue his horrific spree for decades more.
Which leads us to that truly mind-boggling scale. 93 confessed murders.
Across 19 states. Between 1970 and 2005, it's hard to even wrap your head around that number.
It really is.
So who were these victims? Why weren't their disappearances, flagged or investigated more thoroughly?
Tragically, as we've kind of touched on, his victims were often from marginalized communities.
Right.
Sex workers, people struggling with drug addiction, homeless individuals. These were women whose disappearances might not have been immediately reported or, frankly, thoroughly investigated because of societal biases, maybe a lack of resources put into their cases.
He deliberately preyed on that vulnerability, didn't he? Believing these were lives that wouldn't be missed.
Exactly. He said as much. And his primary method of killing strangulation that seems particularly insidious.
How so?
Well, because it often leaves minimal forensic evidence compared to, say, stabbings or shootings.
Ah, okay. Less defined.
Precisely. Unless the body is found very quickly and a really thorough investigation happens right away, strangulation can be difficult to definitively prove. Add to that his reported physical strength, from his boxing background, apparently.
Made him incredibly dangerous.
Very. And the way he disposed of the bodies, often in remote, isolated areas, meant they sometimes weren't found for years.
Or, if they were found, maybe written off as something else, like accidental deaths or overdoses.
That happened too, according to reports.
Yeah.
It just paints this grim picture of how these crimes were able to just continue, completely unchecked, for so long.
It really highlights how systemic issues, maybe societal biases, can inadvertently give cover for just horrific acts like this.
Yeah, the lack of focus on these vulnerable women essentially made them invisible to the justice system for far, far too long.
It's deeply troubling, isn't it, to think how he evaded justice for so many years, even though he had numerous run-ins with law enforcement for other things.
It is.
What were the key factors that let him stay free?
Well, we mentioned the transient lifestyle that was huge, made it incredibly difficult to establish patterns or link crimes across state lines.
Right.
The lack of communication, maybe coordination between different police departments back then, probably played a role too.
And the victims themselves.
Because his victims were often marginalized, their cases just didn't always get the same level of attention, the same resources. That might have led to earlier connections otherwise.
And the strangulation method of, again, lack of clear forensic evidence really hampered things.
Absolutely. It wasn't until 2012, quite late in the game, with an arrest in a Kentucky homeless shelter.
On a narcotics charge, wasn't it? Seemingly totally unrelated.
Exactly. That's when the tide finally began to turn. That arrest led to his DNA being collected and entered into CODIS, the FBI database.
And that routine procedure turned out to be the key.
The crucial breakthrough. His DNA matched evidence from 3 unsolved murders in California from way back in the 1980s.
Wow.
All women who'd been strangled, found in alleys or garbage dumps. Similar circumstances. This was the first concrete link to a pattern of serious violent crime.
So that DNA match leads to his extradition to California, and that's where the confessions start. This astonishing number.
Pretty much. Once they had him on the DNA evidence for those California murders, detectives started interviewing him, asking about other potential victims.
Did he confess right away?
No, apparently initial denials. But over time, he began to open up, eventually confessing to, yes, that staggering 93 killings.
And the details he remembered.
Remarkable, apparently. The level of detail he could recall about each victim, each crime, even decades later.
Sources mention an almost photographic memory for details. Faces, clothing, specific locations. It's disturbing that kind of capacity was used for this, but also that's what helps solve cases, right?
Absolutely. He even provided detectives with sketches, drawings of many of his victims.
Stitches from memory.
From memory, and those proved invaluable in actually identifying some of the women who had been unknown Jane Does for years. It's a chilling reminder of the complexities of the human mind.
And yet, despite this cooperation, this confessing, there's reportedly zero remorse.
A complete absence of it, by all accounts. He even seemed to take this perverse pride in the sheer number of victims and how long he got away with it.
What does that tell us about his psychology?
It speaks to a profound lack of empathy. A deeply ingrained sense of superiority, maybe? He saw his victims as disposable, as less than human.
Just objects.
Pretty much. Individuals whose lives held little value in his eyes. That underscores a chilling dehumanization you often see in serial offenders. He targeted those he thought wouldn't be missed. That shows manipulation, cunning.
So after the confessions start pouring out, law enforcement agencies across the whole country have this massive task, right? Trying to match his stories with their cold cases.
Exactly. A huge undertaking. But his detailed accounts provided crucial leads. And in many instances, his information led directly to identifying victims who'd been nameless for decades.
Bringing some kind of closure, finally, to grieving families.
Some semblance of it, yes, though obviously incredibly painful.
The FBI estimates his confessions have helped solve at least 60 cold cases so far. 60.
It's a significant number, a huge impact on clearing old cases, but it also just underscores those decades of undetected violence.
Must be incredibly difficult for the families finally getting answers after all that time.
Oh, absolutely. It's definitely a double-edged sword. You get resolution, you know what happened, but you also have to confront the horrific reality of their loved one's fate.
And we have to remember, as the sources note, not all of his claimed victims have even been identified, right?
That's true. Some bodies might never be found. Or maybe no missing persons report was ever even filed for some individuals.
Yeah.
The true number, we might never know for sure.
When you try to understand the why, the motivation for such extensive violence. Our sources suggest it wasn't maybe the typical motives you sometimes hear about, like sexual gratification primarily, or power in the usual sense. More like a deep-seated disregard for human life itself.
It seems that way. It appears his main driver was this profound dehumanization of his victims.
Yeah.
He saw them as objects, basically, with little or no inherent worth. That, combined with his cunning in picking vulnerable targets and the transient lifestyle, it just created this terrifying perfect storm, this opportunity for his long, brutal killing spree.
So maybe less about sex, more about control and just the act of taking a life without consequence in his mind.
That seems closer to what the analysis suggests, yes. Though sexual assault was often part of the crime, the core motivation might have been simpler and perhaps even more chilling. Just the ability to kill and get away with it.
Samuel Little died in prison December 2020. He was 80 years old, serving multiple life sentences at the time for 3 of those Los Angeles murders.
Right. His death brought an end to his physical ability to harm, but his legacy. It's undeniably complex.
Oh, so.
Well, while he was held accountable for those 3 specific murders he was convicted of, his real impact now lies in those dozens of other cases his confessions helped resolve. It's just a grim reminder of the sheer scale of his depravity and the lasting pain he inflicted.
And as you mentioned, the sources suggest there's a very real chance he killed even more women than the 93 he confessed to.
It's a chilling thought, yeah. That number could be higher.
How has his case impacted law enforcement, do you think? How they approach cold cases now?
It's definitely highlighted the importance of re-examining unsolved cases, especially involving marginalized individuals whose disappearances might have been overlooked initially.
Right.
It really underscores the need for better communication, better information sharing between different jurisdictions, and the power of DNA databases, other forensic tech, in solving these decades-old crimes.
It also really shines a light on the challenges of transient offenders, doesn't it? People operating across state lines.
Absolutely. It's a stark reminder of that particular challenge for investigators.
So ultimately, the story of Samuel Little, it's tragic, it's disturbing, it highlights both the unimaginable horrors individuals are capable of, and maybe the systemic failures that can let atrocities like this go undetected for so long.
Yeah.
It really leaves you wondering about the victims whose stories might never be fully told.
It does. It raises fundamental questions about how we, as a society, value all human lives and the absolute importance of making sure the most vulnerable among us don't become invisible to the justice system.
True crime no bull.